Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Kyle Anzalone. He's here to talk about Ukraine, US foreign policy, where he sees the counteroffensive going, and kind of just the war in general. It's great to have you here today, Kyle. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
So, for people who don't know you, do you just want to tell people a little bit about yourself, your work, and kind of your show as well?
Yeah, so I host the show Conflicts of Interest along with Connor Freeman. We put out 3 episodes a week. Monday and Wednesday, I do a show where I just kind of talk about the latest news. On Fridays, Connor joins me, and we usually do a little bit of a larger breakdown. Connor will discuss a lot of what's going on in the Middle East, where I more focus on the war in Ukraine. At the Libertarian Institute, I am the news editor, and so most days of the week, usually like Sunday through Thursday, I'm at the Institute writing news stories, typically on foreign policy. I kind of work with Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com to divide up some work, and I'll write up stuff that he's not writing up. And so everything I do is typically posted on the homepage at antiwar.com, where I'm the opinion editor. And so if you go to antiwar.com every morning, the news stories I'm writing at the Institute are linked on the homepage there, along with the stuff that Dave DeCamp and Connor Freeman writes. And then I put together the viewpoint section in the Spotlight article at antiwar.com every day. And so that's kind of what I do. I don't have, like any particular degree or credentials in the American empire or foreign policy. I'm a relentless reader and kind of I would say just somebody who likes to learn about stuff. And so I've spent a lot of time over really, the past 10 years, but really working, tirelessly since, 2014, 2015 to keep up with all the foreign policy news, read and figure out who all the key players are, and try to understand why American foreign policy is the way it is.
Yeah, you and Dave DeCamp, he's been on before. The amount of articles you guys put out at antiwar.com, that is the go-to place. I promote it every time kind of one of you's on the show. It's literally one of the best resources. And then you'll kind of have your, separate shows, Scott Horton's show, Dave DeCamp does a run through, you do one. So anyone who needs, US foreign policy, go there. Just out of interest, so you said you kind of really tirelessly started doing it in 2014. Have you always been like a political kind of guy, or was there something that kind of set you in motion? Dave DeCamp kind of said it was, for him, it was like finding out Israel had nukes and kind of from there.
Yeah, so I guess I was always a little bit more political in high school and in college. I was on the debate team, but in college I had already found Ron Paul. But so a lot of the foreign policy stuff that was big for me was when you're in high school debate, you're basically just given 100 pages every month to read about a particular issue. And so we would, get 100 pages, and it's all cutouts from the Washington Post, from American officials, and, all the very standard Democrat versus Republican. And a lot of the topics were foreign policy based. And so I knew the establishment positions on this very, very well. And then I discovered Scott Horton and Ron Paul in antiwar.com. And it was so clear who was right, because I was so well versed in the establishment narrative. And then when you read Scott Horton, and he puts, it's not like he takes what's coming from the government, what is published at the Washington Post, and just adds that little bit of extra context to really put the whole thing together. And so, for me, once I discovered libertarianism, it just kind of all cascaded really quick, because I was so primed and well versed in the political narrative from a young age, that when you learn the truth, it comes, everything made so much more sense. All the things that I was saying, in all these debates I did in high school, that really, you're just saying to try to win the debate, right? It wasn't about, believing if the U.S. should intervene in the Caucasus, or should stay in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever else we are debating about. That isn't the point of competitive debate. It's just to win. And so I knew everything from both sides of the perspective, and why, kind of the very weak points and flaws in everybody's case. And, then when you hear somebody who's actually speaking the truth, it just, all the lights turn on very, very quickly. So, I became a libertarian in 2009, pretty much right when I got to college. And I spent that time probably, a lot of people were doing a lot more homework, and I was just consuming every libertarian thing I could find. I mean, this was a point in time where there weren't so many libertarian podcasts. It was like maybe the Peter Schiff show. And so you would have like Tom Woods and Stefan Molyneux occasionally guest hosting and giving a little bit of hardcore libertarian takes. But you would just find like the Mises Institute speeches of Judge Napolitano, Ron Paul. Like any speech that Ron Paul gave on the House floor was like huge because that's all the libertarian content you had. And then it got a little bit, the 2012 campaign, you really got on board, and that was a big deal just because there was so much energy behind the movement at that time. And then once that was over, there was a lot less energy, and I kind of migrated to really caring about and paying attention to foreign policy. And so pretty much after I got out of college, I just started studying and went this direction.
Yeah, I mean, there's always an admission from an official, congressional hearings, just reports from the government, the military, that kind of, if you add up all the different ones, they start to obviously paint the picture. And then again, as you said, when context is provided, it will kind of make sense. So kind of onto, the subject that's in the news kind of constantly, or not as constantly before, but what is kind of your assessment so far of Ukraine's counter-offensive? Has it made any success? Did it do its objectives that it was meant to be? Or is it starting to show that it's been a failure?
Yeah, I think it's starting to show that it's a failure. It was never really successful at all. And I guess this is kind of what we predicted. Maybe I was a little bit odd. I thought Ukraine would maybe take a little bit more territory just out of sheer aid and weaponry that the West has given to Ukraine, that maybe that would just overwhelm the first line of Russian defenses pretty quickly and at least establish a little bit of a foothold for Ukraine that they could later defend. But it doesn't really seem like any of that happened. And I mean, it shouldn't really be that surprising. I guess it should be a little bit surprising it went as poorly as it did, again, with the amount of aid that Ukraine is receiving from the West. But at the same time, the New York Times was reporting on this counteroffensive in March. And so, I'm sure the Russians were very well aware of it beforehand, but I'm certain they were once they read the New York Times. And so that was at the beginning of March. In March, April, May, the counteroffensive doesn't begin until June. And so Russia has at least 3 months to prepare line after line of defense in just mines and mines. And also during that time, they're making 7-8 times the amount of artillery rounds the West is making currently. And so as Ukraine depleted a lot of their resources in the Battle of Bakhmut over the winter and early spring, Russia, I'm sure, was just, even if they were using a lot of their resources, they're producing more resources, more military weapons, particularly the 105 millimeter artillery rounds, which are so crucial at this point. So, this counteroffensive never really had a chance to do what it was intended to do. And that was to essentially part the Russian, what they call land bridge between mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula. And, I described this as early in the war, Russia turned the Sea of Azov into a Russian lake. It's no longer a sea. This is now territory 100% controlled by Russia. And I think it's going to remain that way forever. And this is essentially what they're trying to do, is reach the Sea of Azov and split the Russian lines and their ability, I guess, to move, forces from mainland Russia to southern Ukraine and Kherson and areas like that, Zaporizhia, and to retake territory there. And that had no chance at all of happening. Now, there are cities between where the Ukrainian lines currently are and the Sea of Azov. And I did think maybe, again, they would breach the first line and take a significant amount of territory, maybe up to the second or third line. But that hasn't happened. I think it's probably a result of a couple things. Again, the Russians being far more entrenched. Russia this time, last time, the part of the reason Ukraine was successful in their fall counteroffensive was because there was a bluff to the south, and they went in the Ukraine's eastern region, and were able to take back Kharkiv in another pretty major city up in the northeastern region, which was always less important to Russia. You know what I mean? I guess Russia probably at the time would have calculated that they would prefer to hold on to the south than the east. And so, Ukraine was going to go with a feint, that fall for it in the south and let them take the east. And that's kind of what happened. But this time, they're going for the south, which is what Russia is unwilling to give up. And I think Daniel Davis described it as basically the Ukrainians just walking into a Russian buzzsaw in the south because Russia was so well prepared for it. And so, this should never expected to have been a success at all. And comparing it to last fall was always stupid and only something the American mainstream media and Western officials did. But the level of catastrophe that's been for Ukraine, I really didn't think it would be this high. They're saying that it's not over yet. I guess they're really trying to spin some kind of positive narrative before Congress has to vote on this $24 billion package, and that the White House is trying to get for Ukraine. And I don't think they're going to get. They just sent the Abrams tanks into Ukraine, so I do think they're going to push Ukraine into carrying out another major push in the south. I don't think it's going to work, but they do want to be able to say that Ukraine is gaining momentum. So I guess they, figure if they turn it from, we took 200 meters to taking 600 meters, they could claim, look, momentum, and we need to send them more arms. But I'm not even sure that's going to happen. I think it's just going to be a very bloody mess for Ukraine between now and in the time where it gets too muddy and their armor just, doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, as you said, there was obviously a big push for this counteroffensive from obviously the West and the media. But I mean, since the counteroffensive has happened, I mean, there seems to be kind of cracks in the narrative of even the media, starting to report, and kind of at the start, it's not going as well as we thought. And, is there kind of a shift in the media, or just cracks in the media that the narrative's kind of falling apart with the counteroffensive?
I mean, certainly we had, I believe in July, the Wall Street Journal report that the West knew that Ukraine didn't have the army, the maneuvers, the equipment needed to breach the Russian lines. They just hoped Ukrainian courage would win the day. And we've had other unnamed officials admit, and Ukrainian officials admit, that, the counteroffensive isn't going to achieve its main goals. But all, officials speaking on the record still won't admit that. And so the narrative is starting to change. I think it probably reflects some the fact that it's very hard not to recognize it. Just if you look at a map, people expect the color of the map to change, right? The side that's Russian should be getting smaller, that color should be decreasing, and the color that's Ukraine should be getting bigger. And that's kind of how I think most people are, understand this. And so, they've rolled out generals like Mark Milley to tell the American people, war isn't like World War II. It's not like a video game. It's not like the movies. It's not like when you're watching the History Channel and you see the soldiers and the arrows and everything's moving real quickly. That's not how it works. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of casualties. This is going to be very bloody and very long. And so I think, they're trying to shift the narrative a little bit. They're really trying to diminish Americans' hopes and explain that this is going to be a very long fight. And then we're also getting admissions from people, too, that hey, this is a great investment. They say that most of the money that's being spent is going to the American arms industry. No Americans are dying. Don't worry about the Ukrainians. No Americans are dying. And this is great. And Russians are dying like hell.
We have, I think,
Free or die.
Free or die.
Now you are free,
Yes.
and we will be.
And the Russians are dying.
the things you do for your country. Thank you very much for your coming. Thank you very much. Thanks, United States people of the United States, for all big support. President Biden, bipartisan support, Congress, and really we thank you so much.
Bipartisan support.
Yes, it's very important. So we appreciate for We know that from first days we have total support. It's about 38 billion, and it's big support, very
The
important.
best money we've ever spent.
Thank you so much.
No, it's, we're on this is 457th day of a war that was supposed to last 3 days. You amaze me. Your country amazes me.
It's about our people and about your people. Your people help our people. All our appreciations.
You remind me of our better selves in America. That there was a time in America that we were this way, fighting to the last person. We're going to be free or die.
Free or die.
Free or die.
Now you are free,
Yes.
and we will be.
And the Russians are dying.
Yes, but they came to our territory.
Yeah.
We are not fighting on their territory.
Being able to take an amount which equals what, about 5% of our military budget, but actually less than 5% of our military budget each year to help the Ukrainians is about the best national defense spending I think we've ever done. We're losing no lives in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are fighting heroically against Russia that has 1,500 nuclear weapons aimed at us. It's like, so we're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a very small amount of money relative to what we spend in the rest of defense.
Yeah, this is great. Like, Putin's getting weakened, and which is apparently the goal of everyone in Washington, that we have to weaken Putin for some reason. We'll spend $100 billion on that just to weaken Putin. I think one of the really awful things about this war is it's not about Ukraine at all. And it's not really about Russia either. It's about China. And there's two things. One thing they convinced themselves of, and that is that if Russia is able to get away with this in Ukraine, then China is going to think that they could get away with it in Taiwan. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. The situations are far different. The military parities are far different. The way that the Chinese government does business is far different than the way that the Russian government does business. Also, it's a lot easier to blockade an island than it is to blockade a country that shares a land border with 3 or 4 NATO nations, right? So, just strategically, it's very different. There's a lot of different calculations that Beijing has to make, and a lot of different maneuvers that Beijing could do versus the options that Putin and Russia had. But the second thing they kind of point to, and this they do a little bit more slyly, because I do think they, to some extent, realize that this is their fault, is they have pushed China and Russia into a really global community with a lot of what's termed as the global South. And that's mainly because most of the other countries other than Russia that are, northern in the world are already a part of the North Atlantic Alliance. And so, all these countries that really are the outcast of the American empire: Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, Zimbabwe. I'm sure I'm leaving like some off this list. And then other countries that, want to, they either see a need. So like with China, they need a lot of oil and commodities. And so, Saudi Arabia and the UAE aren't just going to let Iran get in all on the China and India market. They're definitely going to sell oil to those companies or those countries, even if the American empire says no. And so, I think that this is really what they're worried about, is this growing community that is not an adversary or even necessarily a competitor to the American empire. It just wants to be independent of it. The South African president at the latest BRIT summit, when they announced they were adding 6 new members, explained that right now the way the world works is that if there's a country that is developing and the United States, he didn't say the United States, but he meant the United States, if the United States decides that they want to slow that country's development, they could cripple it, right? Like just instantly, they could cut that country off from the world economy. They could cancel all their international loans, no more SWIFT, all these transaction systems, they have to go another route. And so this has made the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this kind of Beijing-based counter to the G20 and then the BRICS Plus as real alternatives, because so many countries are saying, if you want to sanction and isolate North Korea, it's not that hard. Or even North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela, and Cuba, all possible. But if you're going to try to also isolate Russia and China and then tell India that they have to choose between Russia and China or America, then, now you've created this massive global community that has the ability to do business independent of the U.S. and the U.S. dollar. I mean, the Washington, it's almost like in a comical way, right? Rather than seeing that the American empire is overextended and bearing too heavy of a load, rather than starting to say that, what, we're going to let Russia and China have their sphere of influence. And the U.S. is really, not that I support this, but they really just want to focus on having control over the Western hemisphere, and probably also mostly, geopolitical dominance over Africa and the Middle East. That was all possible as long as it doesn't assert that China doesn't get to, we'd say that China doesn't get to dictate what happens in the South China Sea. Russia doesn't get to dictate what happens in Ukraine and the Caucasus. This drew those red lines so far that we're too overextended. And rather than, again, trying to offload some of this burden and focus on what is actually achievable, they've tried to do everything. And now it's going to, it's basically stacking everything up and really causing the thing they fear most to happen at an accelerated rate.
Yeah, so since you've kind of brought that up, I was going to talk about that later, but we can kind of go back to Ukraine since you're on it now. I mean, you make great points there. And I mean, so many people have been obviously pointing out, as you've said, how they've treated Russia, China, and all these other countries. They've pushed them together to create another bloc that can kind of not even just challenge it, but just kind of replace the kind of the rules-based international order since World War II. And you just have to wonder kind of the US policymakers who keep kind of making these mistakes. So you mentioned Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and I'll probably maybe throw in Egypt. Obviously, they've been invited to BRICS, and they've started to, say maybe their trade in the non-US, obviously dollar currency, maybe in the Chinese yuan, and sell oil. Do you see, what do you see the US kind of move within kind of the Gulf to prevent this? Or do you think if they want to have any kind of control over those countries still, they're going to have to let them kind of trade with those countries to still, have some sort of relationship with them? Where do you think kind of that relationship's going to go with Russia, China, and the Gulf?
So, I think we've already seen the UAE is a member of the Abraham's Accord, and under the Abraham's Accord, they agreed to normalize relations with Israel, which they already had a normalized relationship with Israel anyways. If anything, that relationship was already too nefarious, and Washington shouldn't have been encouraging it at all. But, we agreed to do this, and we were supposed to sell F-35s to the UAE. And that actually doesn't look like it's going to happen, because the U.S. tried to force the UAE to get some Chinese company out of their country. And they said, no, we would rather have China here than the F-35s. I think when you look at Saudi Arabia, the U.S. is trying to get Saudi Arabia to basically extend the Abraham's Accord, to agree to normalize relations with Israel. And in exchange, they're going to give them a Japanese or South Korean style alliance and security guarantees. So I guess just short of what the NATO members get is essentially what they're going to promise to Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia has already entered BRICS Plus and already signed a deal with China aimed at normalizing relations with Iran. And what they're basically asking for everything from the U.S. I think they want a nuclear program, and this is a little bit like technical, but Saudi Arabia really wants a nuclear program given to them by the U.S., but that allows them to enrich their own uranium. And they want this to be able to basically have a latent nuclear program, or maybe build a bomb. But to start with, they just want to have all the abilities in their country to build a bomb. And certainly Iran does as well. But Washington in the past has tried to sign what they call a 1, 2, 3 agreement with countries, where you have the nuclear reactor in your country, and that produces the nuclear fuel. And rather than having the enrichment capabilities in the country and the ability to build like the nuclear rods and things like that in country, what you do is you ship it back out to the United States. We enrich it and provide the rods and fuel back to the countries. And so and also I guess they would sell them probably reactors that aren't capable of producing like very enriched uranium or plutonium. But so, they're trying to put limits on the nuclear programs, energy programs that they give to countries. And Saudi Arabia really doesn't want to have to subject themselves to those. And so I'm concerned that the Biden administration will be willing to essentially give everything away to Saudi Arabia in exchange to try to make sure that that Riyadh is a part of the Washington Empire and not a part of this kind of independent access to countries. I just don't think it's going to work. Even if they do sign the normalization agreement, what's going to happen if they break it? Or Israel's not going to go to war with Saudi Arabia over it. The two countries get along, and not very public ways, but covertly they certainly help each other on the security level. And it's not like Saudi Arabia really does anything for the Palestinians. And then again, if you look at like the oil issue, Saudi Arabia hasn't complied with the US demands, particularly what was it around the midterm elections, that the Biden administration really wanted them to produce some more oil to drop oil prices, and they refused. So it's this crazy situation right now where you have Washington, which is the center of the world empire. We are the dominant military force. Everything is traded in the dollar. And yet you have these countries in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia and like the UAE and other countries like Ukraine as well, who dictate terms to Washington and then snub Washington anyways. And you would think that if you were the world empire, that at least when a vassal state does something like this, you would punish them. But in reality, they just bribe them more to try to get them, to at least publicly say that they're in line with the U.S. And it's just this crazy, insane policy where Washington's able to give away all the money they want and have no ability to conduct diplomacy with any country. So they just rely on handing out bribes.
I mean, one of the few vassal states that would be punished, I guess, would be Germany, because they got their pipeline obviously bombed. But if you're the
US... that's amazing, right? Though that in a lot of ways, we would kind of lean on Germany or the UK. Certainly under Trump, he was willing to lean on some of these European countries far more than any of the Middle Eastern countries, and so. It's just kind of, should be confusing. The countries you would assume are the most firm allies of the United States tend to be the ones that Washington feels comfortable leaning on, when it's anybody who has any independent thought at all usually gets bribed to get back into line. I guess unless you go, kind of cross that line, I guess it's not that hard to turn from Mohammed bin Salman into Saddam Hussein in the eyes of the American empire, but you push it up to the line and you get a lot doing it.
If you're the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and you're like the UAE could have got the F-35s, what can the US really offer them militarily that Russia and China can't, or will not be able to? If they're looking at the US as a declining power and this bloc as gaining, and if it's about military equipment, I mean, surely they could lean on Russia and China for similar kind of guarantees or weaponry.
I mean, America is still the dominant military power in the world. Even if the F-35 isn't quite that capable, we do have just a massive amount of military all over the bases, all over the place. And so, that does bring a lot of influence and things like that. Although, as you mentioned, there are alternatives, and certainly for like these countries where really all they need to do is oppress their internal population, you would think they would be able to get that at least from China. So.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, I mean, obviously the one kind of problem the Gulf nations or anyone with not the best style of government or human rights is, at least with maybe Russia and China, like they're not gonna get lectured about human rights to kind of for their own population's sake, where the West have to kind of put up the facade that we have this relationship so we can lean on them about human rights, where Russia and China might not have to do that. They might not have to be outraged by certain things. So kind of before we kind of get back to Ukraine, with kind of this multipolar world breaking out, where do you see it going with the US? Do you think it's going to have to acquiesce, or is it going to possibly do something drastic like full on go to war? I mean, even the situation with Russia and Ukraine, we talk about it as a proxy war, but I mean, it's basically a war with Russia, with how kind of intense this is. It's less indirect than maybe so many other times in the Cold War or Syria. Like, this is on their border. So do you think the US is going to do something drastic, or maybe could it be, certain European countries just say, every once in a while you hear France and Germany kind of feel like they've had enough. They don't want to, especially with China. So I guess I know this is a long question. Where do you kind of see the US's reaction being to this multipolar world?
Well, I guess I'm feeling optimistic today, so I will say that they don't decide to go to war, although there's nothing that any U.S. official has ever done that would suggest to me that we would bat down at some point. So I don't have a good reason to believe that, just because, it's the unthinkable. It's nuclear war with Russia or China is kind of what we're looking at if the U.S. isn't at least even backing down, maybe too strong of a word of what needs to happen, but to just firmly reorient our policy to tell Ukraine, like, hey, you got like $5 billion left of funds that we made up for you to get in arms. That's what you're going to get. You better negotiate a deal with Putin before the end of the year, because that's when you run out of weapons. And then from there, Ukraine declares neutrality. The U.S. doesn't have to say it's a defeat, but Kiev decides that it was time to negotiate. They negotiate on their terms, and they kind of say that we're walking away from this region now. That that could happen. It's not impossible. Does that seem like something that Jake Sullivan or Victoria Nuland or Antony Blinken or anybody in the White House, maybe other than CIA Director William Burns, which is terrifying, that that, and it's not just me that said this, like, it has been reported that Biden has essentially used William Burns, the director of the CIA, in roles that a diplomat would usually fulfill, because I guess he can't get Antony Blinken to do anything diplomatic whatsoever. So, General Mark Milley has also, although he's on his way out now, I think he's actually retiring in like 4 or 5 days here, last November, he said, hey, now would be a good time to negotiate. The fact that there seems to be a declining number of those voices in the government, not increasing. We got Victoria Nuland gets a promotion. Not that Wendy Sherman was anything decent, but at least she sometimes was interested in diplomacy, and Victoria Nuland never is. She's a real hardcore, neocon. And so, and again, we could say that we're going to end, not end our support for Taiwan, but we're going to end it where it is. We'll continue with what we're doing and curtail it and try to get back to the one China policy over a few administrations. Or, things like this could really happen. It doesn't really look like the U.S. is backing down, especially with China. They're always willing to look and negotiate in the long term. And so, just giving China a little bit of respect in the Taiwan Strait, giving China a little bit of respect in the South China Sea would probably go a really long way. And do Americans care at all about Taiwan Strait transits? Does anyone care other than people it upsets? And the answer is obviously no. And so, we could just stop doing that kind of stuff and really de-escalate tensions. And, I do think there's probably not going to be a way to reverse the trend of dollar dominance in the world. My guess is that, you're never, like, economics and monetary systems and things, within companies and countries and things like that are evolving and changing. I think they're moving away from the dollar, and I don't think that's going to fully reverse. I think, China, India, Russia, especially the BRICS countries, the 5 core members and maybe some of the other ones will really start to move to doing trade in bilateral currency. Probably. I don't think they're really going to be able to establish like an actual BRICS common currency, but Russia will trade with China in whichever ruble or yuan or whatever they want to trade in. They're going to dictate those terms between countries, and that is going to impact the dominance of the dollar on the global stage. And I don't think that's going to be really unwind, but it could happen at a much, much slower pace if Washington, starts to or stops adding to sanctions. We'll start there. If they stop adding to sanctions, I think that would be a pretty good start. And then, in the long run, start to at least like strip off some of these, like the sanctions on the Chinese defense minister and things like that. Could be real steps towards moving towards diplomacy. And then if you roll back a few economic sanctions as well, it could, really start to prevent China from moving so rapidly towards doing trading outside the dollar.
Yeah, just on China for a second. I mean, I've asked this question a couple times because, again, in my head, I just can't really work out, I guess, the answer, and they weren't really sure too. So obviously, on the military side and kind of, government officials and Congress, clearly, obviously, fear-mongering towards China, and you have the arms industry who can obviously make money off that. But for the other kind of corporations outside of that kind of military realm, is there not any opposition to this kind of path that currently the US is on with China? Because they obviously have so much business with China in the world economy, production over there. Is there any signs that, other US corporations aren't really on board with this? Because I asked this and it doesn't really seem like there's much opposition, which is kind of strange. So do you have any idea on that? Again, it's speculation, or unless you have any insight, obviously.
So I did have a really interaction with somebody recently at a libertarian event. They worked at a major U.S. tech firm, or at least previously did, and they told me that they had basically received a memo that Taiwan was a part of China. And the person was telling me how horrible this was because, it's a suppression of freedom of speech and everything like that. And I was like, this is the best news I've heard on the China issue in some time, because the fact that Microsoft doesn't want to upset Beijing means that there is some interest in making sure that there is some interest within the American political sphere and companies that have influence in not letting this situation get too out of hand and like maintain some relationship with China. So I don't know, like I don't see it actually in policy, it's not making a difference on, whatever's coming out of Washington. Any resistance that American companies now have doesn't seem to be impacting anything at all. At the same time, I do wonder, like a lot of these companies that do business in China and things like that, if they're just trying to look to keep it on the down low because it's so kind of politically bad in America, because the Uyghur genocide narrative has really been accepted. I know we don't have time to go through that today. I'm sure you talked to Patrick McFarland about that, at least some. So, maybe the PR with doing like business with China is so bad that they're unwilling to, that they're unwilling to like kind of publicly take a stand and push politicians to like have a more normal policy with China. But maybe that'll come back around. And again, these companies do seem to not want to upset China too much on a lot, like Disney and some of their stuff, the NBA and some of the decisions that they make. NBA represents not maybe a huge company in itself, but think of like who all the owners of the NBA teams are. And, that really goes towards the NBA making this decision. And so, it's just, it does seem like there is at least some interest in the U.S. business sphere to not, upset China too much. But at the same time, it's not reflected at all right now in what's coming out of Washington. And so you do wonder what that disconnect is and why, American money, like in other places in the world, like the military industrial complex, is able to drive policy in Ukraine. And maybe that's just because the military industrial complex has such a stranglehold on policy right now or something like that. I'm not sure. I guess I don't have a good answer for you either.
Yeah, it's a strange one. I mean, you still have kind of people like Henry Kissinger and Bill Gates who kind of obviously meet China and there's kind of a warmth between them. I mean, it's a strange thought to think that maybe corporations and Henry Kissinger and Bill Gates are actually quietly lobbying, under wraps to keep the relationship going. But I'm not sure what that would be. Just again, actually, before we go to Ukraine, on China. So with Ukraine, I mean, there's, as much as there's kind of been splits in NATO, there's kind of been a firmness, and you have countries like Denmark, Norway, who are kind of, being more hardline than maybe people like France and other countries. But on China, there seems to be a real kind of split outside of the US, UK about, how to deal with China. You obviously have Macron. He went to China, and there was that article about him saying that we shouldn't basically be, a vassal of the US. And then his palace kind of people came in and had to basically scrub some of it because it was too harsh. And then you have, Germany kind of saying similar things, and other countries. So do you think that the US is going to be able to get the same type of support in NATO? I think there was actually an article, I can't remember, might have been in Bloomberg. It was Niall Ferguson, who said he spoke to some officials, and he said basically the only countries the US can count on in China is Japan, the UK, Australia, and maybe Canada, and that was it. So where do you kind of fall on? Are they just going to give in to US power, or are their business relationships with China just going to be kind of too strong to be able to do what they did with Russia?
It's a great question, and I wish I had a good, solid answer for you. I guess in some ways, I feel like it's kind of the same with the companies, where these countries have a real business interest in China. And like you said, the French president took a whole delegation of French businesses with him to China. And Germany has, asserted that it wants to maintain its business relationship with China. But then the U.S. is able to get these countries to participate in war games in the South China Sea, or the FONOP operations, that's the freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. I think Germany signed up for a couple of those pretty recently. So again, the economic interests are not matching the policy that's coming out of these countries. And it's kind of hard to figure out why. At this point, in one sense, it seems like there's more cohesion within NATO than ever before. And so you would imagine that, if the U.S. wants to take the alliance in whatever direction they want, everybody is kind of signed up to NATO so important that we have to, that they're just going to go along with it. But at the same time, you do have to imagine that for a country, say like Poland, the Baltic states, or Germany, if they believe the threat from Russia is real, how many military assets are they willing to send for them, the other side of Eurasia to for a country that's going to be no threat to them. And again, doing that is going to provoke economic tensions between the two countries. And, none of these states are as large or as powerful economically in the U.S. And I don't think there's any doubt that the trade war with China has hurt U.S. businesses to some degree, but it would probably sting a lot more for, Germany or any of the other countries. So, you mentioned there the list of countries that are firm, they support the American empire no matter what. And I guess are kind of, like the legacy of the British Empire, that core bit of it. So I think it would probably split. Like, I can't imagine Turkey sending anyone, to China to do anything provocative. But at the same time, we have seen that NATO isn't as cohesive, I guess, as it always appears either. Turkey has looked to mediate and end the war in Ukraine. Recently, we've had the Hungarian president saying he's done supporting Kiev on the international stage. Poland says they're no longer arming Ukraine. Slovakia isn't importing Ukrainian grain, and Zelensky is saying that Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary are all benefiting Russia and basically supporting Vladimir Putin. So, things could fracture very quickly if you press too hard on them and push too hard. And so, while it seems to me that you're probably right in the instinct that what would happen is they would just kind of go along with Washington and end up getting involved in whatever Washington has going on in the South China Sea and with the Taiwan Strait. If it's not logistically possible or it's just too much to ask. Maybe it does actually fracture the NATO alliance in these countries, especially France and Germany as the big ones say no.
Yeah, definitely be interesting to kind of see where that goes. You mentioned Poland there. That was actually going to be one of my questions, and I don't know how much you know about this, but where do you think kind of the Polish-Ukrainian relationship's going to go? Obviously, some people are saying it's just kind of a potential political stunt because they have elections soon. Because obviously Poland has been one of the steadfast supporters of Ukraine along with the US and the UK. But there's also been mentioned there's a lot of kind of historical tensions in the background because of like World War II and things like that. So where do you kind of see that going? Do you think Poland will eventually resume kind of sending military equipment after the election, or just in general, or is this really kind of bugging them about the grain imports?
Yeah, so again, I think there's a lot here because there are those historical tensions, and they do matter to Poland. But clearly from the first 18 months of this war, they don't matter to Poland so much that they weren't willing to support Ukraine. And we're one of the loudest proponents of NATO getting more involved, sending more arms and more support to Kiev through the first 18 months of this war. I mean, Warsaw was one of the loudest voices for that. However, once maybe that drive ends, then the voices mentioning the fact that a lot of these Ukrainian forces that Poland and the U.S. is arming, have legacy, draw roots, draw inspiration, and look at figures from the Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe, and the SS operations that happened in Poland and Ukraine, and how there was, I believe, a pretty significant ethnic cleansing of Poles. I don't think this is really like a controversial thing that people dispute this happened, that there was an ethnic cleansing of Poles in Ukraine by Ukrainians aligned with the Nazis during World War II. And so, and this is actually one of the guys that was just in the Canadian Parliament. And this has, caused a lot of controversy. And now, you actually have people saying, are they really Nazis? Yes, that they were actual Nazis. And that's why, today you have so many Ukrainians running around with Nazi insignias on, whether it's the Nazi, the Azov battalion patch, or the Black Sun. There's tons of them constantly. If you just went through Twitter, or probably the mainstream, if you looked at the New York Times, Reuters, AP, all the mainstream outlets today, I bet you could find a picture of a Ukrainian soldier wearing a Nazi patch. It's almost daily that you're able to find them. In fact, the reporters have had to ask them to take them off. And so, this history, I think, is probably, becoming more significant as the hysteria supporting for Ukraine wears off in Poland. And so on my show recently, I was talking about, I thought the U.S. would take one of two courses. They would either try to punish Warsaw or bribe Warsaw. And we got our answer a lot faster than I assumed. I think they're looking to like give Poland, some kind of privileged financing for like $2 billion of military arms. So, let's see how Poland reacts. I think the Poles, particularly the government, were particularly insulted by the statements that Zelensky made at the United Nations, saying that Poland was basically helping or was helping Russia with its ban on importing Ukrainian grain. And personalities are important when it comes to world politics. As stupid as it sounds, you assume the world leader of Poland, when offered a $2 billion bribe from the U.S., would assume that's what's best for my country and take the money. But if he's really like, I hate Zelensky now, and I'm willing and would happily watch this guy burn as Russia bombed his capital city, and I refuse to provide him arms because he personally insulted me and I hate him now, that happens. That's how governments work. So let's see how Poland responds. My guess is they're going to end up taking the bribe.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. They probably will end up taking. I mean, it was kind of strange because there's kind of been times where Zelensky kind of has insulted even the British, the US, to seem kind of ungrateful that we keep sending weapons. And then, he keeps asking for more and seeming ungrateful, which he may, but then he also may say that, I'm fighting this war against Russia for you. So, I'm also doing this to the benefit of you. So, and same with Poland, obviously they have historical tensions with Russia and also Germany too, which is why probably the Polish MEP, whose husband of Anne Applebaum said "Thank you USA" when the Nord Stream pipeline was bombed. But just as we kind of getting to the last bit here, so you mentioned it kind of earlier. So if the counteroffensive in Ukraine fails, where do you see the war going? What's kind of the long-term plan? In some of your recent videos, you've talked about how officials have been talking really late into the 20s, 27, 28, about certain equipment being sent there, and just the war, preparing the public for a long war, kind of like the old war on terror. So can you just kind of tell the audience about those kind of comments?
Yeah, I guess first, just acknowledge that war is unpredictable. And while it seems absolutely impossible there would be a major Russian collapse, that Putin would likely resort to using heavy bombers, not necessarily nukes right away, but just, carpet bombing and taking out, Kiev and the decision-making centers in Ukraine, I think would happen long before the collapse of the Russian army. And so I don't really see that as a possibility. But before I go on and explain why I think this thing's going to draw along for years, probably, I will say that, at some point, the Ukrainian people might get tired of, not the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian people might be done with fighting. And if they don't have enough men and women to fill the ranks, and, as we said in the early war, the West fights Russia until the last Ukrainian, I guess, with the note of willing to fight at the end of that. Who knows? The war can end within months, or probably months. I would guess, if that's kind of the scenario that we're looking at. I think more likely we see Russia launch their own offensive sometime soon, and that they do make some territorial gains, probably greater than or at least equal to what Ukraine was able to take. Maybe not in the same region. I'm not sure what Russia is really interested. I would guess tactically they're most interested in Odessa, and not really, trying to take the cities in eastern Ukraine, maybe securing the full Donbass territory, but really looking at Odessa in the south of Ukraine, and trying to cut Kiev off from the Black Sea. So I'm not sure where Russia will launch their offensive from. I'm not sure what they're going to aim to take. Again, war is unpredictable, but I would guess that, based on what Ukraine has expended and what Russia has been able to build up over the past few months, that the Russian counteroffensive will not meet the same issues that the Ukrainian counteroffensive did. Russia will retake some territory. What Ukraine does then, maybe Kiev waits up. Maybe Zelensky decides to negotiate. I'm not sure exactly what Russia is looking for in the war at this point. It may be that Russia really isn't looking to negotiate with Kiev at this point, that they really do plan to take Odessa. That's the only way they could feel that they could truly make Ukraine a neutral rump state, is by cutting it off from the Black Sea, that would give Russia enough control over what happens in Ukraine to be able to negotiate and settle, because Russia is now in a situation where they've annexed the regions of Ukraine that are primarily people who are ethnic Russians, intended to vote in Ukraine's elections prior to the war, for candidates that wanted at least a balanced, if not pro-Russian approach. And so if you were to hold an election today in Ukraine, minus the territory that Russia has now annexed, you're probably going to get a pretty hard line to neo-Nazi Ukrainian ethno-nationalists in office. And so I don't know if that really works. And so, I imagine that Russia at this point is going to take a substantial chunk of Ukraine, because that's the only way Moscow is going to be able to alleviate the fears that Ukraine poses. And I'm not sure, again, if that includes Kiev, but certainly I think Odessa. And so my guess is that this goes on at least for another couple years, until Russia is able to take all the territory that they want to take, and then they would basically tell Ukraine, we took what we want, declare neutrality, and this could end, or we'll keep taking more. If Ukraine's willing to keep fighting, I think the West is willing to back Ukraine, as you said, till 2027, 2028. That's when they're talking about the F-16s that they're approved to send Ukraine as becoming effective. And so, this could stretch on until that point. I kind of doubt it goes that long. I think Russia would achieve their ends militarily before then. But I don't think we're necessarily looking at months either, unless we have a somewhat unexpected collapse of the Ukrainian government / military. Although, what politics in Washington are always important, although I'm sure the Pentagon could come up with more accounting errors and just lie. They're not really tracking the weapons, so who's to say what's even in Ukraine at this point anyways? They could send to Ukraine whatever they want, essentially. So, as much as I would like to think that Washington will tell Kiev to end this sooner rather than later, I don't see that happening either.
Yeah, I mean, based off the comments from anyone in the US, and as you said kind of earlier, these statements about how, we're going to back Ukraine for a long time, and, there's no US blood being sold. It's the best buck for the money the US has ever got. It's also a deterrent to China. There was a recent GOP Republican ad about supporting Ukraine. It also deters China.
When America arms Ukraine, we get a lot for a little. Putin is an enemy of America. We've used 5% of our defense budget to arm Ukraine, and with it, they've destroyed 50% of Putin's army. We've done all this by sending weapons from storage, not our troops. The more Ukraine weakens Russia, the more it also weakens Russia's closest ally, China. America needs to stand strong against our enemies. That's why Republicans in Congress must continue to support Ukraine.
I think someone put on Twitter, imagine being a Ukrainian getting, forced to fight in the army, and it's all some geopolitical move to deter China. It's quite mind-boggling there. As for kind of Russia, do you see them having any problems down the years with now occupying this territory? Obviously, you said a lot of the people are kind of more pro-Russia in these areas. Do you see them, having some sort of insurgency kind of trouble in the years, or do you think the majority of the population is kind of on board with it, especially maybe after this war? You're on mute.
So it's a tough question. I would guess that to some level, yes. I mean, they've already had insurgency style attacks going on in Russia. If you look at the car bombing of Daria Dugina as one example. So I mean, yes, it's going to continue to some degree. Would it be like the U.S. occupation of Iraq or something like that, where there's car bombs and, suicide attacks going on all the time? I kind of doubt it. I mean, you do have a lot. These Nazi ethno-nationalists are crazy, violent people. They are pretty conclusively now responsible for the sniper assassinations during the Euromaidan revolution, where they were killing protesters and, police alike. So, these people are terrorists. They did burn down a bunch of civilians in, what was it, the Odessa Trade Building, I think was the name of that building, where they killed 4 dozen people, burned them alive in that building that they were occupying in 2014. So you do have a lot of lunatics who are well armed, who are absolutely crazy, who are going to have PTSD and all other kinds of, ailments from the war that are continuing to fuel it. But that's not to let, Russia off the hook for all this entirely either. I mean, I know these lunatics have existed in Ukraine before, but I'm anti-war. And part of the reason why is it has negative consequences for the country waging the war, even if it wins. And so Russia's going to spend a lot of money. It's going to lose a lot of their young men in this war. There's going to be a lot of people within Russia who are upset because, their sons and daughters, some of them will believe glory to the motherland. And, just like the American soldiers who lost, our American families who lost sons and daughters in Iraq, Afghanistan, throughout the Middle East, they'll, embrace the mission in response to the loss, and that's human, that's fine. But there's going to be a lot of other people who turn against the war because of the loss it incurred, and they'll realize, that Putin probably had other options and that other things could have happened here, and this didn't necessarily have to go the way that it did, and my son or daughter didn't have to give their life for this. So I don't think it's going to necessarily be the greatest thing that's ever happened for Russia. I'm not sure how it, impacts Putin's legacy and everything like that from the Russian people. I mean, maybe they'll look at, this as basic, because this is the Russian, homeland that we're talking about here, that Russians really do feel was threatened by NATO expansion. And is not to, again, to promote the Russian narrative too much, but if you look at what happened post Cold War, the expansion of NATO, the movement of NATO forces further and further and closer to Russia's border, that there did need to be some rebalancing of the security situation in Europe, especially after the withdrawal of the INF Treaty and the anti-ballistic missile treaty by the U.S. during the Bush administration. There were a lot of strategic weapons in Eastern Europe, and that really did have to be addressed. And so, maybe from the Russian perspective, they will see Putin's war here as a big cost, but a historic cost that Russia had to pay to maintain the safety of its homeland. But, again, it is going to come with a significant cost to the country, and that's going to be paid over generations.
Just before I ask for your final comments, you kind of mentioned it there. Do you think Russia gets off too lightly in certain camps about doing the war, and kind of people just kind of, obviously, as provocative as the US and NATO is, and there's no really disagreement in that unless you're kind of in denial. Do you think that people let off Russia just a bit lightly about the war?
Certainly. There's reasons for it that are more understandable, which, some of them are, look at what the U.S. has done, and we really shouldn't be condemning other governments. And anytime you condemn Russia, it's used by fuel from the Hots to fuel the war in Ukraine, and certainly don't want to do that. And so I do understand why people are resistant to give too much criticism to Russia. But, just merely saying that you don't support the war, that Russia shouldn't have done it, that this is going to have negative consequences for Russia, as all wars do, I don't think are really things that give too much fuel to the hawkish narrative. And look, I think there's a big difference between supporting an anti-war movement in your home country and supporting an anti-war movement in a country that your government has deemed an adversary. And so, there are things that I understand are, a little bit more acceptable, but there are certainly people who kind of exist around the anti-empire movement in the U.S. who are pretty much pro-Russia, where everything that happens is, this is just a part of Putin's grand scheme. He never made any mistakes as far as this war goes, tactically or anything. And, the Ukrainian military has been on the brink of collapse for 18 months. And so there are I think, a group of people who are essentially Russian apologists and Russian spin artists. But that's a pretty small camp, and we really don't have to worry about those people too much. I think best to just ignore them and kind of let them appeal to, whatever small segment of the Russian population speaks English and really gets a kick out of Americans, kind of promoting the Russian narrative. But for the most part, I don't think these people are too problematic and should just be ignored. But certainly there are people, again, within the anti-interventionist movement who have become apologists for Russia. And so I don't want to say that those people don't exist.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said there. And obviously, if you live in the UK like me, or the US like you're going to focus on their actions more than the Russian side, because you live there. That's what and more affects you, and you can talk to people in your own country about it. But just for your final comments, is there anything else you want to kind of let people know about the Ukraine war or US foreign policy in general? If not, then just kind of tell people again where to find yourself, I'll put it up on the screen. I put everything in the show notes. But yeah, if you have any final comments kind of about the topics we've discussed today, anything you want people or think that they should know?
Yeah, the U.S. military, the U.S. government are not led by great men and women. These people are the most below average, power hungry maniacs that you can imagine. They don't have insights that you don't have. They don't care about people or understand the Middle East or Ukraine or Russia more than you. They're just lunatics with power looking to make money. And so, don't trust what they're saying when the Biden administration officials tell you how the war is going, when the Washington reports how American officials say the war is going uncritically. Don't believe it, because the people delivering you that message are not smarter than you. And it took a long time to realize that, but particularly with the Biden administration, I mean, the word midwit is perfect to describe so many officials in the Biden administration who, if they wanted to achieve some real foreign policy aims that even I don't support, you could see how they could have been achieved. But again, trying to take on Russia, China, Iran, they could have returned to the Obama era nuclear deal, and for some reason haven't. Like, that is just inexplicable and incredibly stupid, because normalizing relations with Iran, or not even normalizing, but just even having some relationship, economic relationship with Iran, would have meant that throughout this war, the U.S. could have put pressure on Iran to support Russia less, or to, produce more oil, ship more oil to Western countries, and kind of help out with what the U.S. is trying to do in Ukraine. Again, I don't support the proxy war in Ukraine. I'm just saying, if you want to wage a proxy war in Ukraine, you should try to strip away the main allies, or the main countries that the country you're opposing supports. And so, trying not to pick fights with Iran, China, North Korea at a time when you're trying to, win this proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, has driven all these countries closer together, and, made the war in Ukraine even more unwinnable for the Ukrainians. And so there's no coherent strategy within Washington.
Yeah, I think that's really well summed up. I mean, it is really strange to kind of see their policy from the outside. And just to kind of add on what you've said, I mean, a lot of people may have supported the Ukraine war at the start because, Russia invaded, and, they had sympathy for them. But I mean, by now, just based off their own comments, the US government officials and Congress, where they're saying stuff like they're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, this is the best money we've ever spent because it's hurting Russia and all this stuff, you've got to see maybe by now that they're clearly not doing this to save Ukraine. It's only going to destroy them more and more and more. But yeah, couldn't agree more with what you said there. So yeah, if you just want to give people kind of where to go, I mean, I know you said at the start, Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, conflicts of interest is your show. Anything else there I've missed?
No, that's everything. And thank you so much for having me on. Let me talk to your audience.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for coming on, and appreciate all your time and your work.
Thank you.